Good evening, everyone. I would just like to acknowledge country. I acknowledge that I live, work and learn on Gadigal country. I recognise with gratitude the safe haven offered to my family at a time when life and the future were uncertain. I recognise the ongoing connections to lands, waters and skies of all traditional custodians across Australia. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and elders past and present. Good evening, everyone. My name is Estelle Roginski and I am the Co-Vice President of the Australian Society of Polish Jews and Their Descendants, ASPJ, and specifically New South Wales. For those of you unfamiliar with our organisation, our statement of purpose is to preserve and promote the historical and cultural heritage of Jewish life in Poland and to foster understanding between current and future generations of the Polish and Jewish communities. Good evening to those of you who have joined us here in Australia and the US. Good morning to you in Europe and Israel. Dobry wieczór, dzień dobry, and shalom. This evening, ASPJ board member, Professor Lucy Taksa, will be in conversation with Rabbi Rapoport. Lucy is professor with the Deakin University Business School and Deputy Director of Deakin Centre for Refugee Employment and Advocacy, Training and Education. Outside of Australia, she is Senior Fellow with the Centre for Unframed Thinking at Rennes Business School, France, and member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Centre on Global Migration at Gothenburg University, Sweden. We at ASPJ wish to extend a heartfelt welcome to you, Rabbi, for making time in your schedule to share your experiences with us. Born in Stockholm, 1977, to a Polish Jewish mother, Rabbi Rapoport migrated to Sweden from Poland following the events of March 1968. Actually, his mother did, and his father. Yeah. You weren't there. As I worked the mathematics out, I just thought that was wrong. Polish was spoken in his family home and remains close to his heart. Rabbi Rapoport completed his 5 years of rabbinical studies at Yeshivat Hamivtar in Israel. In 2002, on completing his studies, he took up the position of Rabbi of Oslo in Norway until 2006. From 2006 to 2011, he became Rabbi of Wroclaw, where he also worked as an emissary for the Israeli organization Shavei Israel. On his return to Israel, he continued to work for Shavei Israel and at the Noahide World Center. In August 2021, at the invitation of Michael Shudrick, the Chief Rabbi of Poland, he returned to Poland and began to work with the Jewish Community of Warsaw, where he continues to work till today. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. You will have an opportunity for a Q&A. If you wouldn't mind using the Q&A function on your screen as opposed to your chat, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And enjoy this evening's conversation. Thank you. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you. And good evening, everybody, in all the languages that you may engage in other than English. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to Rabbi Rapoport for the second time. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting, all of us, wherever you may be. And I also acknowledge the cultural diversity and the importance of diversity to the country that we live in Australia. So what we're going to do tonight is to really explore Rabbi's recollections and reflections on what happened to Jewish people in Poland in 1968 and also in the years before that. This is a much forgotten episode in our own history, as well as Polish history, and one which we think has immense significance to what's been happening around us today. For me personally, having been born in Poland and having arrived here at the age of 3, It's significant also because as a child, my parents were very upset about what was happening in 1968. And last year's, or was it this year's Jewish Film Festival screened a film called March 1968, which was very important in reawakening Jewish memories of 1968. So I'm going to ask the Rabbi some leading questions, and following some exchanges with him, I'm going to then go to the Q&A where hopefully you'll post some questions as well. So firstly, Rabbi, can you tell us about your own heritage and history as a Jew of Polish heritage and your own parents' experiences in 1968, but also in the period before 1968?
Well, I was very interested and impressed with the acknowledgement to the land of Australia that you made, Professor, and that Estelle made before you, and I couldn't help but thinking, comparing it to Poland, where Jews have lived for over 1,000 years, and it would be wonderful, I think, if also part of Polish culture became, if Polish culture would also adapt such a statement that you made, because I was very impressed by it, and that would counteract nationalism, the negative part of nationalism, because the negative part of nationalism, the nationalists assume that they have been here forever and everybody else is a foreigner. But I mean, when you look at things, that's just not the case. This is a multicultural land and has been, well, since before the creation of Poland as an entity. But so anyway, sorry, but I wasn't expecting that acknowledgement, and I was very impressed. I had to relate to that. So Poland has partially a wonderful Jewish history and partially a not great Jewish history. And I'm not talking about the Shoah, because that's obviously the most awful thing you could imagine, but I'm talking about in the centuries past. So in the Middle Ages, the at the time greatest halachic authority, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who was in Krakow, wrote that if it wouldn't be for Poland, the diaspora, the exile, would be too difficult. But because of Poland, it's all right. So that means that in the Middle Ages, and for sure we know that based on historical accounts, Jews had it much better in Poland than, for instance, in England, where Jews were expelled more than once during the Middle Ages. The Crusades did what they did around the Rhine River, which is Germany, not Poland. So Jews actually at the time, that's how Jews, or why Jews came to Poland, most probably because of the Crusades, because Ashkenazi Jewry was concentrated around the Rhine River, but then moved. And there's an anecdote that says that when the first Jews came to Polish soil, a piece of paper fell down from the sky, and on it said, the two versions, Polin, here rest. The other version is even nicer, Polania, which is what Jews used to call Poland once upon a time, not Polin, but Polania. And Polania means here rests God. So that's even better, meaning it's not just a resting place, a good place for you to live. It's a place where you, as Jews, can develop and grow in your Jewish identities and in your service of God and so on. And that did indeed happen, because the amount of Jewish literature, and I'm not talking about secular literature that begins in the 19th century and 20th century. I'm talking about the development of Jewish law and Jewish interpretation of the Torah and of the Talmud it doesn't only take place in Poland. It certainly takes place in all Ashkenazic countries, but it very much takes place in Poland. And if we add Lithuania to Poland, which some would say would be historically correct, and also Ukraine to Poland, then it would not be wrong to say that the majority of development of Judaism happened in Poland. It wouldn't be wrong to say that. If we add Ukraine and Ukraine, well, Russia, no, but if we add those countries that are closest, then the majority of the development of Judaism happens here in Poland. Another important point to understand is, and unfortunately this only strengthened anti-Semitism, the person who had it worst was not the Jew. The person who had it worst was the simple Polish peasant who, for all intents and purposes, was a slave. Now, slavery didn't exist, but there was something that in Polish is called pańszczyzna. I actually right now cannot remember the term in English, but it basically means the land belongs to the local count or baron or duke or whatever. The peasant has a contract with this nobleman. The peasant will work the land, and for that he will keep part of what he makes from that land for himself. That's his salary, and the rest he has to give to the Lord. To the nobleman. And this essentially created a situation where the peasants were almost like slaves to the landowners. The landowners were able to, to abuse is an understatement, but they were able to abuse their authority. And so people always say, well, look, Jews had it terrible. We weren't allowed to own land. And that's true. But that also had a positive effect of not being in this relationship with landowners where essentially you were born into this contract. It was not possible to say, no, I don't want, I'm quitting. It's not a free market. You can't quit. And Jews, they weren't part of this equation. So, and Jews also, as we're always proud to remember, and we should be proud, the difference between Jews and non-Jews was mainly, apart from religion and so on, was mainly in the fact that all Jews knew how to read and write. And among the non-Jews, that was non-existent. So the local nobleman, or any nobleman, wanted Jews because they worked for him, and it's only because he could probably not read and write either, the local nobleman. I mean, in Poland we have Casimir the Great, who really built, and he was not the only one. He cannot take Jews into Krakow because that's the capital city, and the Jews, this is a Catholic country. The Jews killed Jesus. It's, they cannot mingle, but will build a little, or not so little, village for them right next to Krakow. And that's Kazimierz. That's today, when you go to Krakow and you see Kazimierz, you think it's one, but it wasn't. Krakow was for Gentiles only, obviously. Jews are not allowed to, but they are allowed to come and work, but they're not allowed to live there. So Casimir the Great builds, and he's not the only one among Polish kings and noblemen who build villages for Jews to come there, and obviously that means that they're. I'm not saying that there's a love between them or whatever, but certainly Jews profit from being able to read and write, and unfortunately for the Jews, the Polish peasant, when he has to come and pay his taxes, and when he's going to be told that you haven't paid even a third of what the nobleman wants, and therefore you will receive the following punishment. The person who tells him that is the Jew who works for the nobleman. He's his accountant, he's his everything, because the nobleman, again, first of all, he's not going to have direct contact with peasants, and second of all, he cannot read and write anyway, so there's no he cannot tell the peasant how much the peasant owes him. So unfortunately, this only strengthens any kind of latent anti-Semitism, because you obviously associate the person who tells you these terrible things that he is evil, although it's not the Jews that decide what the nobleman will do to the peasant who doesn't pay. But so that's
so Rabbi, how did that sort of historical foundation contribute to what happened in the post-war years?
Well, I mean, we should also say one more thing, but I still want to stay in the Middle Ages. I know we should go forward, but I really like history, and I think that whatever happens later is really based on what happened earlier. Until the Crusades, Jews aren't depicted as monsters in Christian art. There's a famous Christian art pre-Crusades where you have the ecclesia and the synagoga, which is the church and the synagogue, as two women. The ecclesia is a beautiful woman. The synagogue is a, well, not so beautiful, but not terribly looking woman. And the synagogue, she has her eyes covered. And this was common before the Crusades. This was that the Jews are blind, meaning Jesus came, they didn't notice, so they're blind, but they're not evil. But as the Crusades go on, and according to some historians at least, in order to justify the killing of Jews, the church had to make the Jews into bad people. And then suddenly you have the Jewish pig. You have in Wrocław medieval architecture that shows a Jewish pig. That happened in the Middle Ages, so to speak, suddenly, because it didn't exist beforehand. And even Augustine, the Catholic theologian of, I don't remember, 9th century, but there is a passage where he says the Jews, don't kill them, don't beat them, right? So because they're just blind, they're stupid, they're not evil. But that does change in the Middle Ages, and I think it's probably because of the Crusades to justify the killing of Jews, because the Crusaders needed money, because it costs money to go from Germany or even from England all the way through Europe to the Holy Land, and many Crusaders were poor. They didn't have any money, so they had to, on the way, rob people. And so in order to make sure that they don't rob other Christians, so the church changes the narrative about the Jews, makes the Jews into these terrible people, and then it's okay to kill them. And we have prayers in our liturgy to this very day connected to the massacres where Jewish cities such as Mainz and Worms and Speyer were massacred, total extermination. So this was a Shoah of then, and that, together with the fact that the Jews were the ones who worked for the noblemen, builds a nasty background. And of course, Jews are Christ killers, but this is all. It all goes into one. And then in the 19th century, when suddenly in Europe this idea of nations is born, which is, again, according to many historians, it's a fake. I mean, it's just created in order to substitute for Christianity. Until that point, it was either you were Catholic or you were Protestant or you were Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. and wars were waged where Christians would kill other Christians because the Pope declared the Pope in Rome declared the Patriarch in Constantinople to be a heretic, and the Patriarch declared the Pope to be a heretic, and so since he's the heretic, so we wage war. But then in the 19th century, because of the technological revolution, the industrial revolution, so the church loses power over people, and then again the narrative has to change, and the narrative changes to nationalism, which probably didn't exist until then. People probably defined themselves firstly based on religion, and secondly based on very local, you can't call it nationalism, very local adherence, that I belong to this village and this piece of land. But nobody in the Middle Ages who lived in southern Poland thought of the people living in northern Poland as his landsmen. There's no connection. I mean, who cares about them? There's no connection to them anyway. But the Jews, obviously, they didn't fit with the church narrative, and they didn't fit with the nationalist narrative either. So, well, I mean, in Poland, Piłsudski, Józef Piłsudski, was a quite anti-church man, and the Jews very much liked Piłsudski, very much, because he wanted really to create a country where Jews are also Poles. It doesn't matter, as long as you're here and you're loyal to Polish independence and whatever we call Polish culture, you're okay, you're one of us. And this had already happened also before, to a small extent. You had Jewish, you had soldiers in every Polish uprising. When you go back as far as you can in history, you get to Berel Yoselevich. This is a couple of 100 years ago. I think it's even in the 18th century. Yeah, and that's Jewish soldiers in a Polish army. So that's actually quite amazing, because I think at the time, I'm not sure Jews could be soldiers in the British army. I don't know, and I don't want to badmouth the British, but they were certainly not okay in the Middle Ages. But maybe by then, I don't know.
So, Rabbi, we've got a number of people that have come to hear about your experiences and your family's experiences of 1968.
Sure.
For many that are interested in this event, it really started in 1967 after the Six-Day War, right?
Yes.
Perhaps you could tell us how your family ended up in Sweden.
Sure. Well, the background of 1968 is that after the war, about 10% of Polish Jews survived the war, mostly in the Soviet Union. And since before the war, there were 3.5 million Jews in Poland, which is a larger number of Jews that have ever existed in any country apart from inside Israel. So 350,000 people survive. After the war, a year or two after the war, the Central Jewish Committee makes lists of Jews with surnames and everything, and get to 150,000 people. So, because obviously most people left, but still there are 150,000 people of Jews. There are 150,000 Jews in Poland sometime after the war. There is one Polish village in Lower Silesia. There's one village in Lower Silesia after the war that has a majority Jewish population. So everyone thinks that the villages with a majority Jewish populations were all in Galicia before the war. And of course, there were more of them then, but the new terrains after Churchill and Stalin moved the borders, and what had been Eastern Germany became Western Poland, So those terrains were filled by people from the Soviet Union, and of course, who had Polish roots, and among them, of course, Jews. And so there is Jewish life after the war. The synagogue in Warsaw, the Noahide synagogue, which survived because the Germans used it as stables, it starts working as a synagogue in the summer of 1945. So right away, it continues its life as a synagogue. And in Lower Silesia and in Upper Silesia, and also also in the north of Poland, as long as we're on the very western part of Poland, which had been Eastern Germany previously, you have a lot of Jews, tens of thousands for sure. You have synagogues, you have some mikvahs, you have some Jewish schools. Well, you have synagogues for sure. So there is something still there, and then and originally originally the Soviet Union thought that Israel was going to become a socialist state, so they were actually supportive of Israel at the very beginning. But then in 1967, the Six-Day War, and there's a switch, and certainly the narrative becomes very quickly that Israel is bad. But what happens in Poland, the first secretary of the party is Gomulka. And Gomulka, ironically, his wife is Jewish. So there were lots of jokes about that at the time. I mean, because he kicked out the Jews and his wife was Jewish, so probably, But anyway, the point is that he feels there's the revolutions, or not revolutions, but there's something happening in Czechoslovakia where the powers, the communist powers are weakened. And so Gomulka fears that he will be ousted, because he's quite a stupid person, independently of anything that has to do with Jews. And so he thinks, how do I get everyone to, how do I rally everyone? So, and obviously the Jews, I mean, that has worked always before, but you cannot officially go against the Jews, so you go against the Zionists. And to the extent that in Polish newspapers, lists of surnames are printed of quote unquote Zionist surnames, basically Jewish surnames, or surnames that they say sound Jewish. And people, you can even see this in the Kollel Museum in Warsaw, how people sat looking at these lists, and thinking, do I know somebody? Wait, maybe somebody who I know is a Zionist. And of course, the accusation is absurd, but it does happen.
The historians say that it was called an anti-Zionist campaign, but of course it was a misnomer because, as you say, it was anti-Semitic. And those lists followed the sacking of Jewish members of the military, Jewish academics, school teachers, etc., and led to the deportation of some 13,000 people. So your mother was one of them, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Sure.
And your uncle, you also told me.
Yeah, our pre-war ancestry is from the Kielce region, but after the war, certainly it was impossible to return to that region, especially considering the pogrom that happened there. So they went to Silesia, that's where all the Jews went. My great uncle, he was, I guess it's fair to say, one of the last Orthodox learned Jews, rabbis in Poland after the war. He was, of course, that also before the war, but before the war there were many. After the war they weren't. He and my mother and her parents lived in Sosnowiec, which is right next to Upper Silesia. And just to get a feel, in the apartment building where they lived, there were no non-Jews. not a question how many Jews. There were no non-Jews. And my mother told me about how her uncle or her father would send her to walk around the apartment building or the buildings to get people for a minyan. If there weren't enough people, or to have a second minyan. So if you can walk from building to building and ask people to come to minyan, and this is in the 1950s, so clearly there are some Jews. But then, yes, in the aftermath of 1967, the whole 1968 campaign begins. One experience that my mother had was she had, of course, good Polish friends. With some of them, she's in touch until this very day. And at the time, some of her very good friends came to her and said, you know what, you're going to come and live with us now. Because they were really afraid, these friends of hers, that there was going to be pogroms. Especially when we're talking, she lived in Katowice at the time, which is right next to Sosnowiec. But Katowice is already Silesia, and well, either way, the point is that the miners, meaning people who worked in mines, in coal mines, there were staged demonstrations where they would bus them to certain places, and it's kind of, I guess, somehow or a bit to compare with the Nazi propaganda machine, in which things are staged carefully. So here also things are staged, and it doesn't get to pogroms, but certainly there's a lot of aggression, and there are demonstrations where you have thousands of miners stomping their feet together, and of course you get scared that it'll go one step further. So her Polish friends told her to come and live with them. She did. And of course, people were fired from their jobs, and students were evicted from universities. And it's not a free market, so it's not like you can just go somewhere else. At the time, because Gomułka, he wanted money, obviously, and foreign money. So he made a deal, or not officially, but HIAS, the Jewish organization that helped Jews, HIAS paid Poland per Jew, and at the time, in order for everything to not be that we're kicking out the Jews, so what happened was that in a country where you couldn't just leave the country when you wanted to, Jews received visas to go elsewhere. Parallelly, their Polish citizenship was revoked. And so my mother was on one of those trains to Vienna, where they were told that they are now stateless because they have no citizenship. And they were told, which of course scared people a lot, that if somebody would kill them now, no court would convict that person because they are stateless. They have no rights, right? Citizenship comes with rights, and they have no citizenship, so they have no rights. And so these trains to Vienna were locked and closed, and of course it's not comparable with World War II and cattle cars, but still, you're putting people on trains, you're locking the doors, you're telling them if something happens to you, nobody will be prosecuted for killing you if that happens. Their belongings are confiscated. They're allowed to bring a box of stuff with them, but basically each box is very carefully searched, and idiotic rules are created in order to make sure that anything that has any real value will remain. Also here, there's an aspect of again, just anti-Semitism, because, for instance, my grandfather had a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, and that was not allowed to leave Poland because it's part of Polish cultural heritage, which, of course, the official who took that Sefer Torah obviously threw it out. I mean, there's no conceivable reason for why. But this is so to get everything that has value plus rules that simply show anti-Semitism, show hatred of Jews. And how many Jews leave at the time? It's really impossible to say, because could be 20,000, could be even more. Some say 30,000. It's not in one go. It's 1968 and 1969, and there are also some a little bit after that. But there's a that's the concentration is 68, 69, and most of those people go to Scandinavia because at the time, Sweden and Denmark especially opened their doors. Ironically, considering history, Sweden is the harsher of the two, because Sweden only accepts Jews with higher education, while Denmark is happy to receive Jews, whoever they are. So in Sweden, the Polish Jews are, I mean, are quite high in academia. So professors and so on and so forth. But of course, I mean, it's a trauma, to say the least, and it's a well, I mean, it's a criminal act. I mean, although of course the Polish state does not consider itself criminal, but if you look at it from a broader perspective,
So,
and
Rabbi,
yeah,
you've said it's a trauma, and you've mentioned also the Czechoslovakian background. I want to ask you a question about memory and forgetting. You know, we've been very good at memorializing the past in many different ways, but this particular catastrophe, trauma, has seemed to have fallen out of memory. Certainly very few people know about what happened in 1968 in Poland. When you compare, they all know Hungary 56 and the Prague Spring and so on. Can you throw some light on what you think is going on there in terms of memory and forgetting?
Well, firstly, because the Polish Jews who leave, I think, based on personal experience, that they work very hard on assimilating into Swedish or Danish society. They're all very successful people, and you know, successful people, they focus on people with passion, whether they're doctors or whatnot. Their focus is their work, and there's no organization until, I think, decades really later. Now there's an organization called Reunion 1968, and there's an organization called Reunion 1969, and I think there's even more organizations already, but right away there isn't, and people go in different directions. I mean, some people, my parents' friends were overwhelmingly other Polish Jews. There are more Polish Jews in Sweden than there are in Poland. So that's, I mean, but until socialism and communism disappears, there is no, I mean, certainly there's no acknowledgement from the Polish socialist state that it did anything. There's barely any acknowledgement even today, but there certainly wasn't any acknowledgement then. there is, I mean, there's just nothing to, after the Shoah, so the Allied soldiers, or some of them, took pictures, made videos. I mean, and there were lots of testimonies, and there were trials, right? I mean, people were even had received death penalties and so on. Nothing like this happened in 1968. In the Polin Museum, I saw films that were being made in 1968, but not about that specifically, just, by the way. But that's the first time I ever saw any real material. Until that time, I only knew what I knew from my mother, from her friends. So there's, I mean, I think that's enough of a reason for why nobody knows, because everyone speaks about the Shoah, and correctly so, and the Shoah has a lot of material, and Yad Vashem in Israel, and so on and so forth, and there's no parallel organization. There's no way of making a parallel organization in 1968. Maybe something can be made 25 years later, or 20 plus years later, when socialism and communism is gone. But even then, what is there to do? I mean, you don't have, thank God, you don't have any camps or anything like that. Some people tried to regain their property, usually unsuccessfully. So my mother also tried, but I mean, they had the audacity to say that they had their own apartment in 1968, their own bought apartment, not allotted, but they had the audacity to say, and they said that they had a signed document that my grandfather, well, I don't know how to say it, he resigned from the apartment. He gave it away to the state. He gave it away. So, I mean, that's obviously rubbish. I knew my grandfather. He died when I was 6 years old. He never gave away his apartment, but there's no way of proving that he didn't. And most people, the overwhelming majority of people that I know who are Polish Jews, they're because of the trauma, they're just disgusted by the whole thing. Most of them, I think, have never visited Poland since. My mother never visited Poland until I was working here professionally as the Rabbi of Wroclaw, and then she came without feeling the necessity to put down any kind of roots or any kind of anything. And although there are some who, even a couple of people who even professionally, meaning they make money out of trying to connect with what happened then, and Polish Jewish culture and whatever. It's their business, but I mean, so many thousands left. I don't know of a single one who has come back. Certainly not their children who were born and raised in Scandinavia. My family was very unique in that my mother wanted me to speak Polish, but I know plenty of children of Polish Jews who don't know any Polish, and even their parents spoke to them in Swedish from a very early age. So it doesn't seem.
But some Jews stayed in Poland, right?
Sure.
Some
I mean,
were not.
If people were intermarried, and or they were communists, so they had a much larger chance of being able to stay. Sure. When I came in 2006, I met people who, for the most part, again, overwhelmingly, almost without exception, were intermarried. And so that's why, because I mean, obviously, Poles were not evicted, and some who also at the time were communists or still. And yeah, so sure, there are people who remained. When Rabbi Shudrich came here in the early 90s, or the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, as an emissary of the Ronald Lauder Foundation, then suddenly people started coming out of the woodworks, but more than coming out of the woodworks, people whose grandparents on their deathbed, more or less, had told them, by the way, I was Jewish. So that became the kind of new backbone of the community, of the Jewish community. So there is no, you don't have the regular, quote unquote, Jewish community of continuity, of where I went to shul with my parents and grandparents, and they went to shul with their parents and grandparents, and so on and so forth. And I mean, Judaism, as obviously is a very family-oriented religion. So that did not exist, and I mean, to a small extent, it starts existing today because now we're already quite a few years after that. I mean, right now, since about the at the time when Rabbi Shudrich came here and for a lot of years after that, there was only Rabbi Shudrich. There was nothing else. And so the community, therefore, consisted of people who either had could prove that they had at least one Jewish grandparent, whichever grandparent, or if they, through Rabbi Shudrich, converted. So also a small group of Orthodox Jews, so to speak, appear. Now, about 10 years ago, the Jewish community changed its bylaws and so on. And today in Warsaw, you have, of course, the Orthodox synagogue, the one that survived the war, but you also have a Reform synagogue and a Reform rabbi, and a very significant part of the members of the organization called the Jewish Community are people who converted Reform. And so the face of the Jewish community has changed.
So, Rabbi, we've got about 10 minutes left. I've been checking on the questions from others. Yes, somebody's mentioned the movie March 68. Yes, we do. Some of us have seen it and agree, Irene, that it was excellent. Whilst others might be thinking of questions to pose to you, I would like to ask you a final question. So you know what's going on around the world at the moment, and in Australia, of course, we've had our own dramas with what they call doxing and lists of Jews being released and so on. And I mean, for me personally, there's a resonance here, maybe childhood memories, I don't know, but I was wondering if you can tell us what you think are their current links. What are the implications? Can we draw historical parallels? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's worse than that. I think sometimes, or quite often, in the media and so on, things sound like early 1930s in Germany, not even 1968 in Poland. Because I mean, there's a witch hunt, total witch hunt, and and the word Zionist has become a curse word, basically. I mean, it's absolutely terrible, and consequences, God knows. But as we always say, the significant difference between now and early 1930s is that there is a Jewish state now. So now Jews won't be just led to the slaughter without anyone standing in their defense. That being said, I mean, it's beyond appalling to see people who are willing to support murderers and rapists, and who are willing to acknowledge in any way, shape, or form an organization like Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran. The ethical relativism that has totally taken over, it's a very, very scary thing.
What's happening in Poland at the moment in that regard? I mean, we all know what's happening in the Western universities in, you know, America, Canada, Australia, England, France.
It's happening less here, but to be honest, that's also because there just are so many more Jews in the countries that you mentioned. So, I mean, it's also, in order for things to happen, you have to have people. So, I mean, in general, I walk with a kippah around Warsaw. I don't feel scared. But then again, people also walk with a kippah in Sydney, right? And in Melbourne and so on. So, you know, and it's clear that there is a much larger element of radical Islam in the Western countries mentioned than in Poland. So there just isn't the raw material here to create the same thing. And in spite of that, some things, yes, have happened. Yes, there have been demonstrations pro-Hamas. And also in the interreligious world, which in general is excellent. In general, the Catholic Church always is very pro-Jewish, so to speak, or open and happy to have any kind of cooperation and so on. And a couple of weeks ago, a very highly situated professor and priest, who I've known for almost 3 years now, and who is, I mean, he really is great. He really is very, and suddenly he calls me out of the blue and he wants to make a conference, and he says, you know, we really don't like Netanyahu and what's happening in Gaza. I thought to myself, hey, you're a theologian. You know, until now, you have always wanted meetings when we speak about how you look at a psalm and how we look at a psalm, and comparing prayers, and you know, and now suddenly you want to make a conference about something which is clearly nothing to do, right, with your expertise. And that was completely out of the blue. And of course, I said, no, I'm not going to participate in anything like that. But the mere fact that it happened is terrible in and of itself. So, but you're worse off than we are, but that's for other reasons. I mean, we just don't have we don't have that which can happen at American university campuses, because we don't have those people here. So
we have a comment from Sam Salzman, who said, my meetings in 1970 with Polish Jewish students who went to Malmo in 1970 suggested that many held anti-Zionist views and did not consider immigration, I think that says, at the time, to Israel. Would you like to comment, respond to that
Well,
from Sam?
that fits perfectly with what I said before, that the accusation that Jews were Zionists, I mean, the accusation in 1968 was absurd. Was absurd because it had no connection to reality whatsoever. And proof in fact, so most Jews that left in 1968 and 69 do not go to Israel. Only a very small number do. So clearly, those Jews, Zionism is not very high up on their agenda. But it's also obvious that it was just a justification for anti-Semitism, that the Jews were accused of being not loyal to the Polish Socialist Republic at the time. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure Sam is right that many or some of the Jews who left Poland weren't very Zionist at all, or were absolutely not Zionist. I mean, it's not an obvious thing that every Jew is Zionist. But in today's climate, I mean, is very similar to 1968 insofar as then, at the time, some Jews in Poland made great efforts to denounce Israel and say that they're very loyal socialists and communists. And there's a certain parallelism happening, certain parallel things happening now, of some Jews doing that, or of people saying that Jews have to do that in order to be kosher, so to speak, and lists, as you mentioned. So it is unfortunately very, very bad. I mean, hopefully it will end, but there's no obvious solution in sight as far as I can see, because it's I mean, once you turn a fire on, it's not that easy to put it out. And once you've accused people and demonized people, I mean, us Jews, once you've demonized Jews, how do you undemonize them? So that I just think that after the Shoah, so the world was in like, oh, now nobody can be anti-Semitic because the Jews suffered tremendously. So, we obviously don't want another Shoah to happen. And on the 7th of October, that was the worst day in Jewish history since the Shoah. And yes, for a few days, suddenly the world was very supportive. But unfortunately, already after a couple of days, the pendulum swung. And well, we all know how bad it is now.
So Estelle is going to, in the last few minutes, ask a question. Thank you, Estelle. Before we round up.
I am going to ask an unusual question in that, how do you see Polish youth today coming forward with the background that they've had and where they sit now, and given the contemporary situation, where do you see them in 5 years' time in Poland?
You mean Polish non-Jewish youth?
I mean Polish Jews who are there.
Jewish youth, not non-Jewish.
Yeah, Jews. Yeah.
Well, I mean, firstly, the numbers are so small that it's difficult, in my opinion, to make broad statements, because in order for broad statements to make sense, you have to have statisticians know this. You have to have a certain group of people. The amount, I mean, most people who became serious about their Jewish identities in the last 20 or even 30 or even 40 years left Poland to Israel, to America, to England, because, well, I mean, obviously it's easier to be a Jew in those countries if you want proper Jewish education, if you want religious life, if you want to marry Jewish, and so on. So, well, I mean, first of all, the numbers, in my opinion, are too small in order to make that kind of statement.
Okay.
I mean, because there just aren't. I mean, you have to actually have people. There is a school in Warsaw, the Lauder Morasha School, which was founded by the Lauder Foundation, but, well, it wouldn't be true, according to any definition, to say that the students are all Jewish. And I mean any definition, meaning not just an Orthodox definition. So, and that's also just one school. So, you know, so if you're talking about youth, I mean, when you're talking about Jewish youth in Sydney or Melbourne, I mean, how many people are you talking about? 50,000? Well, maybe not, but you're certainly talking about thousands of people.
We're talking,
Tens of
yeah, we're talking tens of thousands.
thousands.
All right,
And
so
here we're not even in. I don't think we're talking about 100 people even. So
Okay.
so you know, you can't make that. There
Okay.
are people
So ironically,
I'm discovering the Jewish roots. There are some people all the time, a few here, a few there, who think that they have a Jewish grandparent. Maybe they're Jewish maybe that actually is the case, or it's not the case, and they come to some Jewish event here or some Jewish event there, you know, and maybe they will do a Reform conversion, or maybe they'll do an Orthodox conversion, maybe they'll want to any conversion, and they'll just be kind of next to, but the numbers aren't large enough, I think, to make general statements.
so I have one comment to that, and that's ironically today, I wonder if it's safer to be a millennial in Poland as a Jew than it is perhaps in the Western diaspora. Just an interesting ironic twist. And my other question for you was, or really a statement, was what was the impact of the huge Jewish support for the Ukrainian refugee crisis, where JCC in Krakow was so welcoming and so embracing of the Ukrainian community? Has there been a follow-up for that?
As well, no less than in Krakow. I mean,
So again,
we have people who are more or less active in Jewish life in Warsaw today, who are from the Ukraine and who have been here since the war began. So, I mean, from that perspective, I mean, but I don't think it would be intellectually honest to say that all of Polish society knows what we in the Jewish community did, because I mean, we're so small. Poland received millions of Ukrainian refugees, millions. I mean, I think it came to 7 million or something like that. And I mean, when the war began, I mean, the central train station of Warsaw, the floors were laid with mattresses. I mean, there were people everywhere just sleeping on the ground. I mean, the crisis was crazy. I mean, and the Jewish community did enormous amounts, considering its size, as did all of Polish society. But I don't think it would be intellectually honest to say that Polish society noticed what the Jewish community was doing, because I mean, first of all, the Jewish community was mainly interested in Ukrainian Jews, right? Although it's true that there was no real like, oh, are you for sure Jewish? So it's people could also just receive help to some extent, at least, without proving anything. But on the other hand, I mean, a person who comes to the Jewish community by default, he probably isn't your average Ukrainian, because your average Ukrainian obviously wouldn't go. I mean, why would he? But we did have, we had for our size, I don't remember the numbers right now. There was a hotel outside Warsaw that was rented, the entire hotel. It was not a huge hotel, but still the entire hotel was rented. We kashered their kitchen so that the refugees who stayed there had kosher food. I mean, it was amazing to see how many people were really giving everything that they could. And that's wonderful in and of itself. I mean, right now, I mean, the Ukrainian question is still is a big question in Polish society in general, not in Polish Jewish society, but in Polish society in general. There are unfortunately quite a few voices in Poland who are currently anti-Ukrainian, because I mean, you always have people who are unsuccessful in their own lives and who come with the argument that they're taking our jobs. I mean, that is something that you can already see in Polish media. I mean, for obvious reasons, because people who aren't professors, they well, you know what I mean. I mean that there are people who will say that immigrants are bad because they take our jobs. So, but that again, that's not a. I mean, we're talking here from a Jewish perspective. This has nothing to do with us per se, because we're so small in comparison to the very large amount of Ukrainians who live in Poland today. Many people have speculated, in the media at least, that this was a move done by the Polish government to create, to get immigration, because low birth rates all throughout the Western world. Everybody knows this, but there are no obvious solutions, because
No.
who's going to actually work in 20, 30 years from now, when nobody's being born, which is also not, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but and Poland is a bit better off because of Catholicism, probably is a bit better off. But that's a problematic thing in and of itself. Poland has extremely restrictive abortion laws, which is a very hot potato, politically speaking, and of course religiously speaking. But that's above my pay grade, so to speak, because that's not a Jewish. No, because I mean, we're here to talk about Jewish stuff. So everything that we mentioned before about what happened with Jews in the Middle Ages and later and so on, that's all Jewish. But Polish society as a whole, so get someone who is an expert of that, because I'm not. I mean, I'm a Polish citizen living in Poland, and I can have my own opinion, but that's just a personal opinion. I mean, certainly the Ukrainian immigrants or refugees have given a lot to Polish society. That's without a doubt. And
excuse me, but I think that there was another. Sorry to interrupt you. I think there was another comment. Lucy,
Yeah.
in the Q&A.
Yeah. Sam Salzman said Adam Michnik and his student leader colleagues who led the 1968 march did not post 1989, my opinion, have ever tried to publicly remember the Jewish expulsion in 1968.
Adam Michnik has publicly said that he's a Polish Pole. Adam Michnik, I mean, just for people who are listening and don't know, he is a Jew, at least by ancestry. Both his parents were Jewish, and yes, he was a student leader and he was a fighter for the solidarity movements, as were also other Jews. And he's the general editor of Wyborcza, a very large Polish newspaper, and so on. But I mean, he's one man. I mean, it's a classic, potentially anti-Semitic thing to take something that one Jew does and then apply it to the Jews, because whatever Adam Michnik did or did not do, that's just Adam Michnik, you know. And yes, he is a very big man in Polish society, but there's no meeting of Polish Jews where we all decide what Adam Michnik is going to say, right? There's no Elders of Zion organization, right? In spite of what anti-Semites claim. So whatever Michnik says is just his own personal opinion. The fact that his parents were Jewish, and so he's Jewish by default. But when having been asked about, well, you know, what do you say about your Jewish ancestry or whatever, the phrase "I'm a Polish Pole" does say something. I mean, you know, a Polish
does
Pole.
have resonance. It does have resonance in contemporary society today. It has resonance with the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which have been unfortunate, where people have spoken and without knowledge. Anyway, I think that we've got to wind up here, that it's time to go.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
Are we both going to thank the Rabbi in unison as members of the board of ASPJ New South Wales?
Thank you.
I'm
And
handing it to you.
bardzo.
Yes.
Thank you very much, for your
Yes, thank you, Rabbi.
and energy.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Since we're close to Rosh Hashanah, so let me wish you a Shana Tova Umetuka, a good and sweet 5,785, and a Tiva V'Chatima Tova, that you may be written and sealed in the book of life.
And I'm going to wish for a
so
couple of miracles as well.
And
I could use
can we
a
also
couple of miracles.
Yes. I would just like to end by thanking Eva and Polaron for making this absolutely possible, to have this webinar, and you know, and thank you all the participants that came along, and there will be a recording. Keep looking at the Facebook page, correct, everyone? Yes. Thank you, Rabbi. It's a great pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Likewise, all the best.
All the best.
Thank you.